Hey guys, welcome to Digital Learning Day 3. You'll notice that I titled the Google Slides for tonight, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, as Governor Northam mandated. And I'm kind of parodying something that I saw on the internet recently, which was a page devoted to taking famous lines from poetry and rewriting them in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic. And so one of them that obviously stood out to me immediately was I wandered lonely as a cloud, as the CDC advises. And so I changed it today, considering the news that I'm sure you all have heard by now, which is that schools have closed for the remainder of the year in the state of Virginia. And so we just finished up reading from Wordsworth and Coleridge, these two poets who launched the Romantic period, and we all might be feeling a lot of emotions, especially perhaps the onset of the loneliness that we might feel knowing that we will not be returning to the normal classroom for this school year. But so I wanted to actually kind of um, think about how we can use, this digital platform where we will be seeing each other regularly, but also the stuff that we're reading, especially poetry, as a way to connect us. And so I wanted to share with you an article. I've been spending a lot of time on the internet. So this past weekend on Saturday, it was World Poetry Day. Not sure if you knew that. I did. And this was an article that appeared in The Guardian, written by a Chinese-British poet named Mary Jean Chan, who's pretty contemporary. Her most recent publication won an award in 2019, and she's going to be talking about a poem from that collection in this piece. So I kind of just wanted to open it up today by actually reading to you this newspaper article, considering how relevant it is to what we're doing. In the days after the arrival of COVID-19 in the UK, I watched in horror as government policy failed to mobilize the public and enact drastic social distancing measures comparable to those widely used in other countries. I tried to write, but found myself unable to express something that might be of use. As a poet, I could not muster the right words. On March 13th, I realized that a prose poem of mine, titled Safe Space, from my debut collection was being shared widely on Twitter. I'm actually going to show you that poem. So here's the poem, Safe Space. Wash your hands. Rub soap into foam into lost hands. Focus on the running tap, the way your hands momentarily disappear and you feel safe again. The bathroom is a place you can always rely on in whatever country containing a door you are allowed to lock. Lock the door, even though the flat is empty and there are no mouths, no doors that let the wild things through. Wild love, wild beauty, wild hurt, wild fear, all those beasts in your inner voice whispering, these are the options, fight, flight, or freeze. What a beautiful poem, right? This perfectly contained square of prose poetry that I think pretty accurately captures a lot of the emotions that, we as society, we as humanity are feeling right now. So it kind of makes sense, right, that it would have been circulating on Twitter, right? This girl wrote, in self-isolation, we have never needed each other more. This poem, right, was comfort today. And so she continues in her article, I realized for the first time that this was a SARS poem, which had not occurred to me when I wrote it in 2017. I was 12 years old when the SARS epidemic hit Hong Kong, my home city, in 2003. School meant mandatory medical kits that our teachers inspected every day at the start of class. 2 face masks, a bottle of hand sanitizer, a packet of travel tissues. I knew SARS was serious because of how my father, a rheumatologist, reacted to the news early on during the crisis. I remember him leaving for work in an N95 mask and returning home with the outline of the mask imprinted on his cheek as my mother quickly stripped his suit off at the door for cleaning. One day, my father came home uncharacteristically quiet. He told us that a friend and colleague who had been working on the front line in a local hospital had lost his life to SARS. In the weeks after, I developed a habit of feverishly washing my hands. As an only child, I turned to books for some sorely needed comfort. Soon after, I declared to my parents that I wanted to be a writer. My father replied, "As a doctor, you can cure one person at a time. As a writer, you can heal a whole society." Can you think of any better, more encouraging, supportive words that a parent could tell you when you decide, no, I don't want to pursue, a more lucrative, successful career. I actually want to be a writer. And your dad tells you that in response. How cool, right? As we mark World Poetry Day this year, I can't help but recall this conversation and wonder whether poetry can offer some unique form of solace as we attempt to weather the current storm together, yet apart. Something about the specificity of poetry allows it to crystallize experience, as if one were pausing time. The brevity of a poem and its precision help us tune out the world and its excesses so we might return, if only momentarily, to ourselves. As more and more people practice social distancing, what we don't do becomes just as important as what we accomplish. The way the silences and empty spaces in a poem are crucial to allowing the words that appear on the page to reverberate and sing. Today I turn to my favorite poet, Adrienne Rich, a queer feminist, American writer and essayist whose oeuvre addressed the intertwined political, socioeconomic, and cultural crises faced by the US from the 1950s until 2012, the year she died. I open The Fact of a Door Frame, Selected Poems 1950 to 2001, and turn at random to page 244, and my gaze falls on these words. One citizen like and unlike so many, touched and untouched in passing, each of us now a driven grain, a nucleus, a city in crisis, some busy constructing enclosures, bunkers to escape the common fate. In the next poem, 13 Dedications, Rich writes, I know you are reading this poem listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. The task we cannot refuse is the common fate of living through a pandemic that knows no borders nor discriminates based on race, color, or creed. Recent reports about racism towards East Asians, Chinese people in particular, have made me reflect on my own experiences of microaggressions. The elderly white man who shoved past me on the London Tube during rush hour, a middle-aged white woman on a train to Oxford who merely grunted at me and expected me to move so she could sit until I informed her that I spoke English, and she blushed but did not apologize. The time I got handed someone's bill by a young white couple who had just finished their meal. As someone who identifies as queer, these experiences are often compounded by subtle homophobia, transphobia, as I carefully avoid stares in women's bathrooms or awkwardly answer the question asked by those repeatedly checking the sign on the toilet entrance. Yes, this is the women's bathroom. It is unsurprising then that Chinatowns across cities in the UK faced boycotts much sooner than Italian restaurants, even though COVID-19 had ravaged both Chinese and Italian cities alike. I am reminded of Rich's essay, Women in Honor, Some Notes on Lying, in which she writes, the possibilities that exist between two people or among a group of people are a kind of alchemy. The liar is someone who keeps losing sight of these possibilities. Now, more than ever, I turn to poetry for its propensity towards truth, its tensile strength, and its insistence that language can and must be the bridge that connects us all during these difficult times. Right? I mean, it can be. I mean, we are in the midst of a poetry unit that is, 200 years removed from us. But what I think the Romantic poets and Mary Jean Shannon, every poet, is attempting to do is to express in words on a page for an audience the kinds of emotions that unite us, that make us feel connected. And so I just thought, what a cool piece. And I wanted to share it with you guys. So we are going to be moving into our next kind of wave of Romantic poets. They're often called the late Romantics, I'm sorry. All right, and so we're going to begin with this guy, John Keats, all right, who, though he only wrote and really only lived for a short period of time, his work is considered to be so great that it was written of him that he is with Shakespeare, that his poetry should be placed in the same category as Shakespeare's. So John Keats unfortunately experienced a great deal of death in his family. So his dad died when he was 8, his mom died when he was 14 of tuberculosis, his brother later died of tuberculosis. Spoiler alert, he's going to end up dying from tuberculosis. And so he had a lot of emotions that he wanted to share. And so instead of becoming a surgeon like he had trained to, he gave that up in order to pursue poetry, kind of like Mary Jean Chan. And he was not immediately successful, all right? His poetry was met with a great deal of criticism. In fact, when he did die, fellow romantic poet Percy Shelley was convinced that it was the criticism that killed him, essentially, even though it was really the TB. But like I said, he developed early symptoms of tuberculosis in 1818, and it was actually during the 8 months before his death that he produced his greatest works, essentially, in a time of heightened emotions. And so unfortunately, when he moved to Italy in order to try to seek a more mild climate to help him with his tuberculosis, he did die. And like I said, Percy Shelley was kind of greatly affected by Keats's death, that he ended up writing this beautifully long elegy of some like 30, 40 plus stanzas. And an elegy is a poem that laments, right? It's expressing a very specific feeling of loss, essentially, and grief, and mourning the loss of a loved one. And in the opening stanza, Shelley writes, "His fate and fame shall be an echo and a light unto eternity." So this is actually his tombstone, and on it, it says, "This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet who, on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water, February 24th, 1821. So we actually celebrated his death just a few days ago, a month ago, right? What is time these days? And so obviously he writes, here lies one whose name was writ in water, because he didn't live very long. He, most of his fame and popularity happened after his death, unfortunately, when he was not around to experience it. And so much like that poem that we read during the Renaissance, right, by Spenser, where the speaker of the poem is trying to write down his lover's name in the sand, right, and the tide keeps washing it away. So too, right, is the same kind of, reality expressed. If you try to write anything in water, it's not going to stay. And so he's commenting on the brevity of his own life. And you're actually going to be reading from a poem today, a sonnet, actually, that he wrote, where he comments on basically what I just said, the brevity of life, like how short it is, and how, especially for him, right? I mean, he died when he was 25, how he wasn't able to do all of the things that he wanted to do. So as a romantic, Keats was really interested in the beauty, all right? He did not really concern himself with politics and society's problems. He was much more interested in expressing powerful emotions. He wrote famously that scenery is fine, right? So nature is fine, which is what, Wordsworth and Coleridge were really interested in. They were called the lake poets. But for Keats, human nature is finer. So he was really interested in commenting on the kind of human experience. So as a romantic, the characteristics that he's really interested in are the imagination, right? So, and this is an imagination that is both aesthetically pleasing and sensual. And he's focusing largely on themes of beauty, mortality, and eternity. And he's also really interested on just focusing on the expression of beauty, like art for art's sake. Like it doesn't need to make sense, right? It just needs to be aesthetically pleasing. So the poetic form that we are focusing on today, so unlike Samuel Taylor Coleridge's ballad, you are going to be reading an ode today. So an ode, they originated in Greece and they were originally performed publicly to celebrate athletic victories, and they were usually accompanied by music. The word actually comes from the Greek word that means to sing or chant, and I'm sure you're familiar with songs like Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Later, especially during the English Romantic movement, this poetic form was favored by poets because it allowed them to kind of express these really intense emotions using rich descriptive language. And then now today, we kind of use this term ode to describe any kind of outpouring of praise. And you can find modern ode poems to like totally obscure objects, like a cell phone, ode to my cell phone. Pablo Neruda has a very famous poem, an ode to his socks. So you can write an ode to anything as long as you are kind of expressing, it's opposite of an elegy. You're expressing praise for something. You're trying to commemorate something. Additionally, what we are going to be focusing on today as we read is sound devices. And they're not new, all right, but they are on your poetic terms list. So we've got assonance. Remember, assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound within words. All right, so look at the repetition of the long E sound in the following line. When I have fears that I may cease to be. So underlined there are the E sounds, and fears, cease to be. Consonance is the opposite of that. It's the repetition of consonant sounds. And it's either within words or at the end of words, like that of the st and z sounds in this line. Thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. So you have this st sound repeating at the end of the lines, and then you have the z sound created in the middle of this line, but then also created at the end of hours is the way that we pronounce it. Please remember that these things are different. These sound devices are different from alliteration, right? Which is also repetition of sounds, but remember, alliteration is the repetition of sounds, especially consonants, though it can be vowel sounds at the beginning of words that are arranged closely together. So, you know what? Let's begin. You've heard me talking for far too long probably now, and so you guys should really get into today's assignment. So here it is. This is what you guys are doing. You are going to complete the assignment on Actively Learn for Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. I've heard a lot of feedback from you guys. You are really into Actively Learn, and I'm loving that you are so into it and that you guys were able to access it so easily. So you guys are going to move through this poem. It's kind of lengthy, or it's lengthier. It's not super long. It's written in 5 stanzas. It's in your book on page 799 if you want to follow along there. But you're going to do the same thing like you did for Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You're going to work through the poem. You're going to read through my annotations that I provided to you on the side, and you're going to answer the questions as they appear. Then your homework is to complete the assignment on Common Lit for Keats's When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. This poem is also in your book. It's on page 803. All right. It's a sonnet. You guys are sonnet masters. You can do this. All right. He's really going to be talking, like I mentioned earlier, he's commenting on his own mortality and thinking about all of the things that he can and cannot accomplish, in our short lifespan. Please also don't forget about your nature journal. I'm going to put a post online. This is my goal for the nature journal. I want you guys to have 5 entries by the time that it's due. All right. And I don't really care when those 5 entries happen. I keep telling you to do it for homework. But honestly, it should be a continuous document. It's a Google Doc that you've already shared with me, and I've already started looking at them. That's going to need to have 5 separate entries by the time that it's due, which is next week. All right. So don't feel like you need to do it today. I know that the weather hasn't exactly been the best. All right. So just, if you don't want to go outside today, don't go outside today. But please remember to get outside, especially now that we know for certain that we are here in the digital world, the digital cloud for the rest of the year. Also, your Membean quiz, don't forget about it. It is only available until 3:15 today. All right, guys. As always, shoot me an email if you have any trouble. Just so you guys know, the poems are included on the following slides, all right, in case you don't have your textbook, but it doesn't matter because you're going to be reading through them on Actively Learn and Common Lit. All right, miss you guys dearly, and I truly, really mean that. And we'll talk soon. Okay, bye.